Tonight we have a special night where we have a joint collaboration between the AIE, the Australian Institute of Energy, the Victorian branch, and the Energy Efficiency Council. And tonight they're going to present, as you can see on the chairs, the Australian Energy Efficiency Policy Handbook, which is a very interesting and very important tool that can help foster discussion about energy efficiency and action within Australia. A few words about the AIE. I'll use the same approach of questions. Has anybody here not heard about the AIE? Just to get some feeling and feedback. Okay, cool. So I see everybody has heard of the AIE. So I'll say in one line, the way we see the AIE, our activity, our vision, and our mission is to help share knowledge and facilitate networking. That's why in an event like this, we have the excellent speakers we have, and afterwards we encourage everybody to stay, have a drink, ask questions, exchange business cards, and just network. I'd like to invite Anna to share some insights from her vast experience in energy and low carbon policy investments. Anna is the Chief Executive Officer at ClimateWorks Australia, an independent research-based non-profit organisation committed to catalysing reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. Anna is also Director of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and a Trustee of the Sustainable Melbourne Fund. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm going to just share a little bit of high-level context for why we at ClimateWorks place such a high priority on energy efficiency when we come at it through the carbon emissions lens, which I know will be quite obvious to many of you. But I also want to highlight particularly how important it is that energy policy gets this right, and there are some areas of integration where we're not there yet. So our starting point is always the science, and the science has now been backed by a unanimous UN agreement. That was the Paris Climate Agreement signed in December. How many in this room would be across what's in that, broadly what's in that agreement? Some. The most important signal that that agreement says is that, one, that it was unanimous actually. Every United Nations government has agreed it. And in the text, the thing they agreed was to keep global warming below 2 degrees, in short. The value of that to the rest of us is that it's mathematically calculatable. So this little chart here shows what that calculation looks like. The blue line represents the carbon emissions into the atmosphere over and above the natural balance since the Industrial Revolution. Scientists have calculated that when we set a 2 degrees warming limit, that means that there's a finite amount of extra carbon we can keep putting into the atmosphere until we've essentially, created that blanket, the analogy that people talk about, that traps the heat in. And the more we put in, the more heat we trap. And they've calculated where is that point where the more we put in, we'll trap enough heat that it's at 2 degrees warming. 2 degrees has been considered a dangerous tipping point by the scientists. The agreement also referred to aiming for 1.5 degrees, because whilst 2 degrees is dangerous globally, it's actually an existential crisis for low-lying Pacific Island states in particular. So 1.5 degrees was added as the stretch target, and there is a large portion of our near neighbours and the population whose livelihoods and indeed nations are at risk if we don't meet the 1.5. For now, most of the science has been done on 2 degrees, and in the next few years it will get updated for the 1.5. So what this chart shows is how much have we already put into the atmosphere, creating that blanket warming up to 2 degrees, and how much more can we put in until we exceed that limit. So the blue triangle is what's left, the room we've got to keep adding until we hit 2 degrees. That triangle's shape is the only thing that we can change. Its volume is set by the science. So its shape, you see, the scientists in this chart have assumed that we don't change for the next decade or so, and it keeps rising at its current rate, and then we turn around. If we manage to turn around faster, then you can see how geometry, you're all engineers, if you flatten the top of that triangle, you can get a bit more width across the bottom. In some charts that I've seen, that can buy us another whole decade, from about 2050 to 2060, where we could still be emitting some residual emissions, if needed, and staying under the 2 degrees threshold, which is important for some of the harder to abate sectors where we haven't actually yet invented the best way to eliminate the emissions. But in the energy sector, we have already invented those solutions. And so I'm going to turn my focus to that. My organisation was part of an international project participating in the lead up to that United Nations agreement, which looked at how can we show governments that we know how to eliminate emissions and stay within that carbon budget. And the result was a technological focused approach that highlighted 4 pillars of action. And when you do these 4, we can stay in the carbon budget and be a net zero emissions economy by mid-century, which is what the science requires. Top of the 4, ambitious energy efficiency, most obviously. The less we use, the less we emit. The second pillar is to decarbonise the electricity supply. Again, because we already know how. We know we can have zero carbon electricity already. When you have decarbonised your electricity supply, pillar 3 focuses on switching across to electricity for any other emitting fuel source that you can. And fuel switching where you can't switch to electricity, but switching, for example, within liquid fuels, say from biodiesel, from diesel to biodiesel, or even to gas or biogas. Those 3 there, the blue ones, are the energy pillars, and then the 4th is what we describe the rest, non-energy. And in short, the message there is sequester the rest. So that's a combination of where there are fugitive emissions from industrial process or industrial process emissions. We will have to look at CCS technology to capture those if they are still going into the atmosphere, unless we've invented a way to not create them. And there's biosequestration, obviously. Carbon forestry can massively absorb a lot of that residual. So we looked at these technologies in Australia using CSIRO data. And what we found is, if we deploy all the technologies that are already in operation, before we wait for any breakthroughs or new inventions, we can eliminate nearly all of our... Oh, this little pointer isn't working. The graph on the right shows what our emissions are today per capita, split into those categories there of combustion, agriculture, waste. And after we've done the 4 pillars of action, you'll see we've almost eliminated, say, all the fuel combustion, but not completely, because on current technologies we would still be flying planes with a mix of, say, biofuel and jet fuel. Similarly, ships. And there is some very residual gas combustion, I think, in some of the industrial processes. In agriculture, you see, it's pretty hard to shrink it. We can do a bit, but ultimately, livestock will still emit methane. Then you can see the fugitive process and waste can be substantially reduced. That's where we can use capture technology. It's not in play right now, but it is invented and can operate. What you see though is that in doing all of that, we've got our emissions down as hard as we can based on technology of a couple of years ago. We're not yet at zero. So then you see we need to offset or balance out the remainder with the biosequestration. And you can see there that we're using carbon forestry in Australia, and we're blessed with a landmass that enables us to achieve that while maintaining food production at current rates. Essentially, you improve agricultural productivity, which allows some of the land to be freed up for the carbon sequestration. When you do all of that, the economy still grows at basically the rates that it has done in recent years. The red line is real export value, the blue line is GDP, and the dotted line is population growth. How is that possible, that we can have our cake and eat it too, so to speak? It's because what we see is the result of this, when we look at the economy today and the economy in a net zero carbon Australia, these 2 charts here show GDP by sector. Basic takeout, broadly similar. The message here is we still have an economy which is slightly increasing its commercial services, as it does in current trends, we still have very substantial share of our economy from mining, manufacturing, energy, transport, ag and power. But the key is we have switched the technologies and the energy sources that power those sectors. So we are still an economy that can mine stuff and make stuff, provided we use energy that doesn't emit. So it's not a structural change to life as we know it or to the economy as we know it, but it is a structural change to the energy sources that underpin the activity that drives that economy. And so that's where you come in at the Institute of Energy, and the engineers in particular, is that we looked at this and the conclusion we found is that it's a technological change more than it is a fundamental breakdown of society or a fundamental rewrite. That's not to say that rewrites wouldn't be helpful, and there's certainly the circular economy movement and a number of new developments that may well see the rewrite happening faster than we expect. But we wanted to send a message to policymakers in particular to not be afraid of committing to the 2 degrees goal and aiming for being a carbon neutral or a net zero emissions economy. We wanted to show that it can be done within the existing frameworks and technologies that we're familiar with broadly. But it needs a lot of policy enablers to get that done. So this is a very high-level summary and certainly doesn't touch on everything that's needed in order to catalyse that technological change that can underpin us decarbonising our economy completely. Focusing on energy alone, I guess the theme of what's missing in the policy mix at the moment that I wanted to draw out was integration. And at the first level, that's integration of carbon with energy. The most obvious being an economy-wide carbon price or other set of long-term emissions targets. It could be caps, safeguard mechanism, any variety of policy measures that sets that economy-wide signal that says we're heading to net zero, here's the trajectory of what it looks like, and it will bite. And both current government and opposition have proposals for you can either do it with direct action or you can do it with ETS. Victoria and South Australia and ACT have already committed their governments to achieving net zero emissions by mid-century. In Victoria, they have announced a more robust process of legally how that will happen in terms of setting rolling 5-year targets that are a decade out in advance. That legislation will go to the Victorian Parliament this year and begin in 2020 onward. So we know that at the state level, the states have been frustrated at the stop-start nature of federal policy, and they're starting to take it on themselves. There's also an enormous opportunity at the federal level next year with the 2017 policy review, which is the first time federally that we've actually had an open book approach to resetting how we do this. And the government committed at Paris to be part of that agreement and said that they'll review the direct action policy and see what more is needed in order to achieve the targets that were committed at Paris. So I'm going to look at that at the next slide. But before I do, I want to talk about this other area of integration that's really important. And that's within energy, the integration of energy efficiency with renewable energy. Now, I've talked about this before to the EEC and Rob and his colleagues. There are a number of drivers for why these two need to be integrated, and the main purpose is how fast we need to scale up this action in order to decarbonise the economy. And essentially my thesis is energy efficiency remains the poor cousin under the David to the Goliath of renewables. Renewables is riding a wave of popular support right now. It's well clear, right? There are billions of dollars of investment flowing, long-term stable policy, even though it's been a little bit unstable, it's there, it's bankable. Institutions like the CFC and others that I'm involved in are deploying funds, as is the private sector. Renewables need to do more, but it's well underway. And you've heard from Rob Murray-Leach why energy efficiency still suffers. If we don't link those two, I'm very worried about two negative impacts. One, we will not achieve staying under the carbon budget in time. And two, we risk a backlash on the renewables progress when prices eventually do rise as we completely renew the electricity system in Australia and replace all the fossil fuel with renewables, as we know is inevitable. So our modelling showed that there will of course be price rises system-wide as that transition occurs, but it's potentially about 40% at the retail level price rises over the next decade, which is actually way less than the almost doubling of network prices we've seen in the last decade. So it's not as substantial as you might think, but still a further 40% price rise is quite substantial and risks significant consumer impact. What we studied though was that is a unit price rise, of course, the number of units sold, and energy efficiency technologies can dramatically reduce the number of units you need to use. We identified that reduction could be 50% per household, more than offsetting the 40% unit price rise. And that's using existing AIE technologies. So consumers are no worse off, marginally better off. Importantly, the message being the bill stays flat even if the unit price rises. So without the AIE and renewables surging, we know that prices are at risk, are likely to rise. And we then risk another one step forward, two steps back situation if politicians try to curb some of that renewables growth. There's also the transactional efficiency argument. We've got 1.5 million homes with the solar panels on their roof. That's 1.5 million vans that drove out to a home and a technician and an electrician went on the roof and put panels on and did not go inside and do any energy efficiency retrofitting. Separately, we've got white certificate schemes like the VEET, which is charging all of us some money, supported by government, spread across consumers, to offer incentives for electricians and tradesmen to go to homes and offer free energy efficiency products. That's a different person in a van driving out to the home with a different transactional cost. And we also know that it's much harder to sell it. So thinking about how policies and business models can integrate so that the one-stop shop service is available to the consumer, that policies potentially, if need be, mandate that if you are going to receive any incentive for renewables, you have to also accept the incentives that are available for EE, or at least declare that you've been offered everything that's available in the book. So there's a number of different ways to look into that. But from the energy efficiency industry perspective, I'm really keen to encourage those of you involved in that to look to the renewables sector and see what marriages you can come up with. What marriages in terms of sales forces, business model delivery, offerings. So at the Sustainable Melbourne Fund, where I'm a trustee, we've been involved in the EUAs, Environmental Upgrade Agreements, which are a way of overcoming split incentives for built environment energy efficiency. And what we have found is by marrying a solar offering with LED lighting, we're getting much better uptake. People want to buy the solar and then they learn the LED is good for them because the incentive and the way we've structured it has attracted a sales force that is skilled enough to offer the two together. We don't see that at a larger scale as much as we should. So I really encourage you in this sector to look to how you can build those bridges, or we will not achieve the goals that we know we need to. And I won't say so much about the other area of integration is obviously storage support and electrification. That third pillar is hardly being discussed at all. We're having a bit of chat about pillar 2 on decarbonising electricity, but we're not yet looking at, once you've got that resource, what we need to do with it, and why is there not national support policies for storage in the way there is for panels on the roof. So to look at what we have got just briefly, this is a little chart you may have seen before of the government's assessment of how will it achieve the target it pledged to Paris. The bars add up to the total carbon emissions reductions that the Australian government has pledged under the Paris Agreement. The red circle, the part that I've circled, is the energy efficiency part. That's the part where the government has already put in a policy. It's a reasonably well-developed policy, and against all the other areas, it's the most well-developed. So there is a lot more work to do in terms of policy for the government to achieve just what we've pledged at the Paris Agreement. And it is well understood that in 5 years' time, the next round of Paris talks will require all governments to increase their pledges. So that means finding more emissions reductions. We studied in the Energy Productivity Plan, the NEP, that there are more reductions available. The government has pledged to improve energy productivity by 40% in the next 15 years, and we showed they could do double that. The waterfalls here show in each sector there is more available than has been pledged. Now, fair enough. It's the first time government's had a national energy productivity plan. They want to convince cabinet members that they can at least meet the target they're going to pledge, so you don't pledge the maximum. I get that. But are you, as an industry, doing what you can to help convince, to show in reality that these technologies can be deployed and that the government can increase its target and therefore its incentives to aim for that technological potential that we know is there? The other way I like to look at it is this chart here. This chart shows the same volume of emissions, that is the volume of emissions reductions that are required to meet the Paris target. The data is actually ClimateWorks data. We submitted it to the government and they've used it in their report, and you can see where I've got that from. What we showed is the 4 pillars of technological potential, and the government chose to show them in a similar order: energy efficiency, the electricity, and a bit of fuel switch and forestry at the end. And then they drew their Paris line. The dotted line there is the target that they've pledged to Paris, the 26%. And the message they're sending from that chart is, it's okay, folks, we can meet our target. Good. They're also sending a message to the National Party, I think, that says, and we don't have to touch forestry. Don't worry, guys. But what they haven't made clear is when we submitted that data to the government, we were looking at the pace and volume of emissions you need to get to net zero by mid-century. And the 2030 point that you need to be at is much greater than what the government has pledged. For example, on energy efficiency, I just showed, they pledged half of what we showed was available. So that energy efficiency first block, they have a policy which covers half of that block. There is not yet a policy to catch the other half. Similarly, low carbon electricity, that block represents over 50% renewables by 2030. Our target, as you know, stops at 2020 and goes to about 23%. Again, about half. So we need dramatically scaled up policies, or we're going to be needing to grab every other source of emissions in the next 15 years alone. In fact, it will be both, because the 1.5 goal will soon become the mainstream goal, I suspect. So I just wanted to share the scale of the challenge, because when speaking to the Institute of Energy, those 2 blue blocks are in your remit. And the reality is the current settings will only get us half the way. So what can we do collectively and with industry to give confidence to consumers to want the stuff, to policymakers to want to incentivise more, and within the 2 to try and get the 2 happening together? Because if we just hit the renewables, you see we are not at our target. And the target is going to be increased in 5 years. I'll round out with this, the value of thinking about these long-term goals. I know I keep talking 2030, 2050, and that's a challenge in politicians' timeframes and it's a challenge in commercial timeframes. But this is a commercial organisation, the CEO of the multinational yogurt maker, Danone. And in a recent interview with McKinsey, he talked about how when they did shift their thinking to the long-term goal, it completely changed their thinking. And he said, we would never have made as much progress with our CO2 reduction program in 2008 if we'd gone for 2% per annum per year reductions, rather than the 30% over 5 years, which we set ourselves. And we actually achieved 42%. At ClimateWorks, we saw that in our own work. We used to live bread and butter reports off cost curves, MAP curves, incremental abatement cost curves, which would start from where you are and see how far you can go in the next 5 or 10 years. The Paris work flipped that on its head and said, know where you need to go. Remember that blue triangle and see what you need to do then. And what we found is it does change the way we think, and it changed even the technologies that we recognised you would do in the next 5 or 10 years. Particularly gas being one of those. When you know you've got to go to net zero, something that looks like a good incremental gain in this 5 years lumps you with an expensive tax legacy at a minimum, and emissions legacy as well in the subsequent 15. So off the back of their experience, Danone has now pledged to be a net zero emissions company. And when probed on why, it wasn't just that they had already shown they could, they actually haven't yet, but I think his estimate of overachieving when they tried gave him confidence to know they could. But the real reason was he said that's where consumer expectations are heading. So I wanted to leave it with you there, and on the concept of thinking long term, it's a reminder that at 2030, which was all the policy bars I showed you, isn't as long term as it might sound. So it's pretty obvious I'm heavily pregnant. This baby that I'm due to deliver in 3 weeks from now will not be out of high school in 2030. When we need to have more than half the system on renewables and more than double the energy efficiency that we know we can get. So we can't wait for her generation to come out of uni and work it out. It's this generation that needs to get us there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna, for the high-level review and overview on the targets and how it's important to set ambitious targets, because otherwise you'll never make it.